Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the fourth and final session of All in the Family, Problematic Relationships in the Law Codes of Deuteronomy with Rabbi David Silber, part of his ongoing Sunday class series on Tanakh. One of the foci in the legal sections of Deuteronomy relates to complicated issues related to family and marriage. These 4 sessions will undertake a series of texts related to the captive consort, the rebellious child, the defaming husband, and the recalcitrant levir. It's been a pleasure learning with Rabbi Silber these past 3 weeks. Thank you for coming back for a 4th one. Sources for today come from Bamidbar and Devarim. You are always welcome to keep your own Tanakh at hand as a reference, but I will also share on screen when Rabbi Silber is quoted. And with that, Rabbi Silber, I'm handing it over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so welcome everybody. July 4th weekend. So it's we're finishing up this brief little 4-part series. I decided to continue our study prior to that, and the focus has been some of the laws in the law code of the book of Devarim. Book of Devarim has many laws, but in particular, there's a focus here in this particular code, which does not appear elsewhere in the Torah. There are several codes in the Torah, one certainly in Sefer Shemot, one in Vayikra, but here in Devarim, there's a lengthy code, and there are 2 particular foci that we don't have earlier. One is war, laws relating to war, as they're about to enter the land, conquer the land, all kinds of rules about war. But the other, interestingly enough, is about family relationships, in particular husband and wife. And today we'll start by turning our attention to children. Again, the law often deals with problematic situations. When you need law in situations where there's a problem. All things are going well, there's less need for a whole set of rules. But when the rules are there to enable people to navigate difficult situations. So one of the situations that the Torah mentions, quite well known, appears in the 21st chapter of Sefer Devarim, in pasuk number 15. It comes right after, verse number 18. Verse number 18, chapter 21, verse number 18. It comes right after 2 sections. The first section of which we discussed, that's the rule about the captive woman, for the Yifat Torah. That's beginning in verse number 10 of chapter 21. Then there's the second situation. A man is married to 2 women. He likes one a lot more than the other. One he loves, one he perhaps dislikes. Each have children, and the Torah says there that when it comes to favoring the firstborn, you see here that the firstborn gets an extra portion in the inheritance. He's not permitted to favor the firstborn of the less liked wife. He must favor the firstborn of the. He's not allowed to favor his beloved wife. He has to treat the oldest child, even though the oldest child is from the disliked wife, but that child has primacy and that child gets the extra portion. Okay, we're not going to get into that. Obviously, it seems to directly contradict the story of Yaakov, not our topic. But right after that, which is our topic, we have the following. Ki yehu ish ben soreh umoreh, einenu shomea b'kol aviv v'kol imo, v'yisru oto, v'lo yishma alehem. A man has a ben sorer umoreh. The translation here is a wayward and defiant son. Mores lasur means to go off the road, to turn aside, to veer off. And moreh is probably related to the word, is understood as a mamreh, which is a rebellious child. A wayward and rebellious child. And they translated defiant, wayward and defiant child. Einenu shamea, he pays no heed. He disregards the directives of his father and his mother. Here the Torah mentions the mother and the father, both parents. He listens, he does not obey his parents. V'yisru oto v'lo yishma alehem v'yisru oto. What does v'yisru oto mean? Again, remember, we are dealing with the plain meaning of the Torah. We'll get to the rabbinic understanding of this parsha, which is very interesting. V'yisrael toli yaser means to discipline. That's what it means, to discipline. Translation is correct. They discipline him. You can discipline in a variety of ways. The term musar, right? Give someone musar. Yaser. It doesn't mean to beat him, but it means to address the problem, to speak directly to somebody in the attempt to correct. V'yisruoto, so they tried. They did their best. Both v'yisru is plural, the mother, the father, perhaps together, perhaps each separately. Discipline the child, to get the child to correct his way. But v'lo yishma lehem, once again, he fails to obey. V'lo yishma. We had it earlier, einenu shomeya. V'tafsu bo avi v'imo. In such a case, the mother and the father grab hold of him. V'yotziu oto el ziknei ro v'yoshar mekamo. They bring him to the elders and to the to the public place, the gate literally of his community. V'yamru ziknei ro, and they speak to the elders of the city. B'neinu zeh soreh umoreh einenu shomeh b'kolenu zolel v'soveh. They say to the elders, the son of ours is once again is soreh umoreh, defiant, rebellious, moreh. He's not our voice. Again, einenu shomeh b'kolenu. And furthermore, they add something else. Zolel v'soveh. Soveh is a drunkard. Soveh is a drunkard. And Zolel they translate as a glutton. So he's not just disobeys us, pays no heed to what we say, even though we've told him, we try to discipline him. We can't discipline this kid. And not only that, he's a glutton and a drunkard. In such a case, the Torah says, let me find 1 second. Next verse is, and all the people of the city shall stone this child, stone him to death. You should eliminate the evil from your midst. And all of Israel will hear and fear. In other words, the punishment of this child, as the Torah presents it, is a warning in general to the larger community: obey your parents, or else. That's what the parsha says. These 4 verses. That's what the parsha says. Now, as is well known, the rabbinic tradition had great difficulty with this parsha, and this is actually an interesting case, interesting situation, interesting example of rabbinic interpretation. An interpretation that essentially does away with ben soreh umoreh. There is a dispute in the Talmud, by the way. According to one view, ben soreh lo haya. There was never actually such a case. It never happened. It's a theoretical description of what theoretically might happen, but in practice, it never happened. And another Tana says, well, Tana or Amora says, I sat on the grave of the ben soreh umoreh. So there's a dispute whether actually it ever happened. And when we get through the rabbinic interpretation, we can see why it's happening. The chances of it happening are very, very remote. But it's interesting that the Gemara basically says straight out that this is very problematic. And it's a good example of how the interpretation essentially does away with the law. Now, here I want to say something about that idea. The interpretation does away with the law. Because some people I've heard them say that all of these drashot that we'll get to in a minute are simply a way to make it so difficult to carry out the law. So from a practical standpoint, the whole point of these understandings that we'll touch on some of them very soon, the whole goal was to eliminate it. They found this thing very problematic. Take a kid and to kill a kid who's maybe drinking a lot or whatever, not paying attention to the parents. They found that extraordinarily problematic. And by use of these various drashot, by making all these different requirements, they essentially eliminated the law. That's not my point of view. I do think they thought it was problematic from the standpoint of carrying it out. But in some theoretical sense, I'm not sure they think that it's problematic. We can certainly say, well, I'll say, I know what we never say anything. Everybody says for themselves. But I will say that certainly I have heard about people, read about people, heard about people who who I said, this guy died at age 45, whatever. Halavai, they would have killed him when he was 5 years old, because given his life, which was pretty much predictable, you could pretty much predict with certainty how this fellow was going to end up. So we're sort of looking at it from a retrospectively. It would have been better had this guy not been around. I remember years ago, maybe some of you recall, there was this whole situation where one of the mafia hitmen was supposed to be buried in Queens, in the community in Queens, and there was a priest, and he was going to give the eulogy or whatever it was, or involved with the burial. I think the people didn't want him buried there, and this priest stepped in and he said, "Listen, of course, his approach was, we are all sinners." Of course, he says, "We're all sinners." He's also a sinner, so we're all sinners. We're the Catholic theology. We're all sinners, and so he's no worse than anybody else. He's entitled to a burial. I mean, all sinners are entitled to a burial. But I remember reading about this guy. He was a mafia hitman, and you could see from the day this guy was born that he was going to end up that way. So I'm not saying you take a 5-year-old and kill him. What I'm saying is that certainly from a retrospective point of view, there are a bunch of people out there who've done unbelievable damage, and looking at it from after the fact, many years later, it would have been better had this person not been around. And I think we can say that about a fair number of people. In any event, I wanted to discuss the two things. One is I wanted to discuss the various drashot, various understandings of this, which are not the plain reading of the text, in my view, and you can discuss that. And then secondly, I want to mention something else. I want to talk about the role of the elders. In the words of the Torah, the zikanim, right? We're told that the parents grab hold of this kid and they bring him el ziknei iro, to the elders of the city. That's in verse number 19. And in verse number 20, they speak, the amro ziknei iro, they speak to the elders, and they say to the elders, "Our son disobeys us," etc. And then he is stoned by the people of the city. What I wanted to talk about is we had discussed previously in our study of Devarim to this point, we pointed out that in Sefer Devarim, the institutions of the nation are actually highlighted. In other words, we have the king, we have the priest, we have the judge, we have the prophet. These are, one could say, institutional leaders of one sort or another. But here we have in the book of Devarim something else, which is the elders of the city. And as we'll see in a little while, the elders come up in various contexts within the book of Devarim. And I think it's useful to think about that. What exactly is the role of these zikanim? What is the role of these elders? Okay. Having said that, let's now begin with the first point, which is the rabbinic interpretation of this short little section. Before I just want to make one other point, that in the Talmud, there are two rules in the book of Devarim that, according to one view, never happened. I don't remember if it says they never will happen, but it never happened. One is the ben soreh umoreh, the rebellious child. And the second, which we did not study, is the city which worships idols, called the so-called Ir Hanidachat, which appeared earlier in the book of Devarim. The entire city worships idols. They were convinced by people that came from the city and convinced them to worship idols. And then the entire city has to be put to death. Men, women, children, everything is burnt, etc., etc. That's called the Ir Hanidachat. And the Talmud has a similar statement by Ir Hanidachat. It never happened. These two things, the Ir Hanidachat and the ben soreh umoreh, are the two situations where the Talmud says it never happened. Now, it is certainly the case And when you study the rabbinic sources about other things such as capital punishment, it's pretty clear that, at least the way the Talmud sets it up, it's hard to imagine that anybody could actually ever be put to death by the court, given the stringencies about how one obtains evidence, testimony, that so and so did this act for which there's a capital punishment, because the requirements of warning. You have to warn them right before. The person says, "I understand it." Maybe even read the biblical verse, etc., etc. So, you have to actually see the act. Circumstantial evidence doesn't work for capital offenses. So the Talmud itself says, and then there are all kinds of other leniencies to try to get the person out of the capital punishment. Talmud has one statement: a court which convicted someone, which executed someone once every 70 years, was considered a bloody court. Whether that's an exaggeration or not, but clearly the rules of evidence are such that it would be very hard to carry out any capital punishment. But that's a whole other interesting topic. But when it comes to the rebellious child and the Ir Hanidachat, there's a view it never happened. But I just want to mention that. Now I want to take a look at some of the drashot that appear in the Mishnah and in the Talmud, the Gemara, relating to this little passage that we read. The first thing is the following. When you read the passage over here, I'll speak a few more minutes and I'll stop and take any comments or questions. When you read the passage, it's clear. What it seems to say is very simple. There's a kid who doesn't listen to his parents. V'yisru, they discipline him, but he still doesn't listen. That's what it says in verse number 18. The Talmud has a different understanding of v'yisru. V'yisru, we take here as, I think we always, to discipline, to give mussar. But the Talmud has a different understanding of v'yisru, because the term v'yisru appears in another section in the Code of Sefer Devarim, one that we actually looked at, and that is in the case where the husband accuses the wife of having some affair. He marries this woman. She's not a virgin, and he says that she must have had an affair. That's called the motzi shemra, the defaming husband, and that's what's found in chapter 22, beginning at verse number 13. So he makes this accusation. But the parents produce counter evidence that demonstrates that in fact she had no affair. They bring the blanket, they bring the sheets or whatever it is. We discussed all that. So he has defamed her. And they demonstrate it. So over there in chapter 22, verse number 18, it says, the elders of the city. Once there too, we have the elders. We'll get back to that. The elders of the city. The elders of the city take this man, v'yisru oto. Here, it's very interesting that if you look at the translation of JPS, the JPS translation is, the elders of that town shall then take that man and flog him. When it comes to v'yisru oto in our parsha of the Ben Soreh Umoreh, what does JPS say? JPS says, discipline him. Discipline. But the exact same two words, v'yisru oto, in chapter 22, with the defaming husband, there the JPS translates, they shall flog him. Now, I'm not here to try to reconcile JPS. JPS is not always, I'm not sure JPS has any attempt at consistency to begin with. And the translations are not always precise, in my view. But what they're coming out of JPS translation of flog him, let's have a defense of JPS, what they're understanding, because the point is that in the context in chapter 22, it says they take this man, v'yisru oto, which they translate flog, malkot, and then v'yonshu oto mea kesef, and they punish him by making him pay a fine of 100 kesef because he defamed the daughters of Israel, and also he's not allowed to send her away with shalcha. He can't divorce her. He must live with her the rest of his life. So, given the fact that the way JPS is reading it, they're looking at it as there are three punishments for this fellow. He's going to pay. He has to pay money. He's not allowed to divorce her no matter what. Must always support her. And on top of that, v'yisruoto, they flog him. Now, v'yisruoto, they give him malchut, is the Talmudic understanding. That's how the Talmud understands v'yisruoto in the case of the Motzi Shemra. But the Talmud takes it one step further and says the same way v'yisruoto in the Motzi Shemra means to give him malchut, to flog, here as well, it means to flog. Now the question is, what do you mean it means to flog? The parents have no right to flog the child, which is probably what's driving JPS. In the other instance, he's brought to the elders and they can flog him. They see it as some kind of a court. It's part of the judicial system. So they have the right to flog him. But over here, JPS translates discipline for the simple reason that it's talking about the parents. That's JPS. That actually makes sense. We have defended JPS. But that's not the plain meaning of the text. That is the plain meaning of the text, but the rabbinic understanding is this: that it's not the parents who be yisruoto. The rabbinic understanding is if parents have a ben sorel morel who fails to listen, then, and it's not in the text, but they said then they have to do something about it. Then they take him to the court, and the court gives him malchut. The yisruoto in the understanding of the Talmud is not the parents, and it doesn't mean discipline. It means they take him to the court, and the court, after hearing what this child has done, maybe he's drunk, a drunkard, a glutton, and all that other, whatever it is, whatever not listening to, whatever that means, and we'll get to that in a couple of minutes. But my point is that by understanding it this way, this already makes the ben sorel moreh, the probability of this happening, it lessens the probability because he's already been beaten up by the court. He's been beaten by the court. So right away, before you get to anything else, by interpreting v'yisruoto as a parallel to the other v'yisruoto, it already limits the probability of this actually happening because the kid was brought to the court, they gave him malchut. Interesting, by the way, just as an aside, I'm wondering whether the term v'yisruoto for malchut is an unusual term for malchut, right? You could have used a different term, that they hit him, right? As it says later on, Abraham Yakenu could have said via hikuoto. But I think what's driving the rabbinic understanding that v'yisruoto could mean malchut, probably it's a play on the word sorer. He's a ben sorer, and the punishment for the ben sorer is v'yisruoto, kind of midah keneged midah. That's the first point. So right away, if you understand it this way, that it's part of a kind of a judicial. It's not just they pick the kid up and bring him, they get him killed. There's a process. First, they take him to the court, and if the court thinks that he's guilty, they flog him. Then, however, if he continues along the path, then the parents take him to the elders and they'll have him, and he's killed. Okay, so that's point number one. Let me stop here for a second before I make the second point, which is the most important point. Well, let me stop here for a minute. Does anybody have any comments or questions about what I've said so far?
Yes, I see, Tova, you had a question in chat, and I also see you have a hand up.
Yeah. I always felt that, this could never be to kill the kid because they say, the way that it's he's supposed to be killed, you could never get the whole community, everybody, to throw a stone at a kid. That's first of all. And isn't he the Rasha the Haggadah. And don't we like to interpret it that the parents do everything to bring him around, but if they can't, then he won't leave Egypt, but the parents have to stay. He's lost to them.
Well, there's no question that, I mean, that is actually what the Torah is saying. The Yisrael Torah, they're trying their best, they're disciplining him, they're talking to him, they're trying to get him to improve. What is problematic for many people, and I think for the Talmud, is the idea of stoning him. It seems like a very extreme response, and I think one that I do agree that this bothered the Talmud. I have no question about that, and that they present it in such a way as to essentially eliminate it. But the point that I'm making is the way they eliminate it is actually very interesting. That's what I wanted to talk about. How do they read this text in a way to eliminate it? And by the same token, I think there is something to be said that in theory, I'm not saying that in practice. In fact, it was probably never done. We have to remember something about the Talmud. The Talmud is written, well, let's see, the Mishnah is 225, let's say. The Talmud is redacted, the Babylonian Talmud, it's probably more than one redaction, but 500, hundreds of years after there was no court. No, this stuff wasn't actually happening. It hadn't happened for hundreds of years. So the whole discussion in the Talmud is on the theoretical plane. It's not that actually it happened. They're not there, it's going on, they want to eliminate it. It hasn't happened in years. Probably, I don't know if it ever happened. But certainly, so they're not talking about, that's not the situation. The situation is a theoretical discussion about trying to understand what is the Torah getting at over here, and what are the problems, and they raise some interesting problems about the Ben Soreh Umoreh, which I will, go ahead, Tova.
Yeah, but don't we have more information now about a rebellious child? He could be a sick child. There could be something wrong.
Right.
No child deserves to be killed. The Talmud had only X amount of knowledge.
Well, the Talmud eliminates. The Talmud gets rid of it. I mean, that's for sure. Gets rid of it. It was already gotten rid of beforehand. That's my point. It's not that it was actually going on. It hadn't gone on for hundreds of years. Hundreds of years. But the Talmud it is a parsha in the Chumash, and the Talmud is trying to make sense out of it. And I'll respond further to in a minute, but I want to make another point about the way the Mishnah understands this, which I think is a very important point. Okay, but I'll get back to you in a couple of minutes about this point. Is there anybody else who has anything to say?
Yes. Yes, Rabbi.
Yes.
I find it hard that the Talmud can say that Yisrael Torah refers to the Zekanim when everything in that pasuk is about the parents, what they do, and the Zekanim aren't brought into the next pasuk.
Well, obviously, of course, of course that's true. By the way, I'm not sure that it's the Zekanim. This is the question in terms of the pshat. Even assuming what the Talmud says to be the pshat, which clearly can't be the pshat, but it doesn't matter. The point is, it's not clear to me that the Zekanim are the ones. We'll talk about this a little later. Who are these Zekanim? Is the Zekanim the court, or does the Zekanim have a different function? Because you have the Zekanim, when we'll get to this in a few minutes, and you have the Shoftim. And it doesn't appear that the Zekanim and the Shoftim are the same people. That's what I want to talk about. But I 1,000% agree with what you're saying. I'm just pointing out the way they're reading it, that's all. But I totally agree with you. It seems to talk about the parents. As I said, you spoke to the parents, try to do their best, they can't do it. But I want to get to a different point now about the Ben Soreh Umoreh, what's actually bothering the Talmud. And, apart from the obvious, what's interesting is this. The question is, the Mishnah raises the question, how old is this child? How old is this child? And the Mishnah says a remarkable thing, actually. The child is actually, what does it mean, a child? So it's a child and there's an adult. And the different stages of adulthood. But one marker of adulthood is actually puberty. So puberty is a marker of adulthood. Is a 12-year-old girl an adult in today's world? No, I wouldn't say that. But it's a marker. It's a bat mitzvah. It marks a certain taking on responsibilities, etc. the point is, first, the Talmud assumes that Parsha only applies to a boy and not a girl. Let's start with that. But in terms of the boy, the Talmud says that the ben soreh umoreh is the first months of puberty. The first few months of puberty, 3 months, 5 months, whatever it is, that's the time for the ben soreh umoreh. I want just to explain what they're getting at over here, which I think is central to the parsha. On one hand, the rabbinic understanding is that a katan, that is a minor, is not responsible. Period. That's the Talmudic, that's the Gemara's understanding of the Mishnah, etc. Whether that's true or not, by the way, as far as the Mishnah is concerned, is far from clear. But that is certainly the Talmudic understanding of the status of the katan. The katan is, as the Talmud says, is not a bar ownership. You don't punish the katan for what the katan does. And there are many discussions in the Talmud about what a katan can do, can't do, transactions, acquisitions, etc., etc., etc. But punishments, the Talmud says, as a clear rule, you never punish a katan, period. So they're very troubled by this, because how can you have a ben soreh umoreh? If a ben soreh means he's 8 years old, he's not responsible for anything. Even if he kills somebody, he's not responsible. So how can you get rid of him? On the other hand, if he's a gadol, what do you mean he doesn't listen to his parents if he's a gadol? Who says he has to? I mean, there is a rule of kibbud of aim, of respecting parents, of honoring parents. But if your parent says, "I want you to go into high tech," and the kid says, "I want to be a lawyer," the parent has no right to. The kid can disobey the parent. There's no obligation to follow the parent, because you're an adult. So the Talmud actually is bothered by this problem. And the Mishnah says there's this gray area where he's not a child, but he's not really an adult either. And it's a very small amount of time, at 3 months, 4 months, whatever it is, typically. And the point is, you see the Talmud is wrestling exactly with this issue. And it makes a lot of sense also, because what do you mean he doesn't obey our voice? Why should he? He's an adult. Oh, so he's not an adult. He's a minor. If he's a minor, how can you do anything to a minor? Right. Now, in point of fact, even when you limit it to this 3 month period or whatever it is, you now essentially made it virtually, you've taken it from 100% chance of it happening to a 0.2% chance of it happening. It's limited to very few months, but they're still bothered by it. On the other hand, what did he do wrong? Okay, so he drinks. Okay, so he's a glutton. Okay, he's disrespectful. Didn't hit his parents. He's just disrespectful. Is that something for which there's a capital offense? And there we have the Talmud, which says, Ben soreh umoreh nerag al shem sofo. And the point of that statement in the Talmud, you don't kill him for anything he's doing today. He is executed according to the rabbinic understanding, because these behaviors are proof positive that when this kid grows up, he will continue to do much worse things, including murder. And before he gets the chance to rob and to kill, etc., we execute him essentially for society's good and for his own good. Now, I know we're all thinking to ourselves, can you really be sure he's going to do this? My answer is no, we can't be sure he's going to do it. But there are some people, when you look back and you say, you know what, I was pretty sure he was going to do it. But my point is that the rabbinic understanding of it, on one hand, is there to eliminate it. But on the other hand, the rabbinic understands, and this is not just about Ben soreh umoreh, this is whenever we're studying rabbinic interpretations of the text. I think it always makes sense to try to figure out, what are they really trying to teach us? What are they really trying to say? I don't think it's not about apologetics here. It's about understanding. I think that, of course, they're bothered by this, but they're also making a very important point about this person, about responsibility to listen, to obey, etc. How old is the kid? The kid's 4 years old. Why should he listen? You know what I mean? If he doesn't, he doesn't. On the other hand, if he's an adult, he's responsible. What do you mean? He's a ben soreh umoreh. So they limit it to this particular time. So in effect, really, in effect, these two different readings, neither of which we would say is the plain reading of the text, that the Yisrael Torah refers to the court and not to the parents, and that the definition of how old has this been, that is a limiting factor. But from a certain perspective, in the theoretical plane, it makes sense that one could say, in effect, that there's a very, very strong probability that this person would be injurious not just to himself and not just to his family, but to society in general. Here we have in the Ben Soreh Umoreh section, we have the statement of the Torah that he is to be executed publicly. V'yarta Rami kirbecha, to eliminate evil from your midst, which is a phrase that appears specifically in the book of Dvarim. And v'chol Yisrael yishmu v'yiro, and all of Israel should hear and fear, is clearly a directive towards the community. In other words, this idea is, it's a warning to the community what happens if the family breaks down, essentially. If there's a breakdown in family discipline, in the role of the parents, a disrespect, which has an impact on the entire community. Do we actually kill such a person? Says the Talmud, in effect, we never do. But the message is an important message. That's a second limitation based on the drasha. I want to mention one more. There are several of these, but I want to mention one more, which I think is very interesting. When they bring the child to the court, they say to the elders of the city, "B'nenu zeh soreh umoreh einenu shomea b'kolenu, soreh v'soveh." So there are two things in the verse, but the first one is, doesn't listen to our voice. So the Talmud notices that when it comes to the Ben Soreh Umoreh, that the Torah mentions the father and the mother, right? Einenu shomea b'kol aviv u'b'kol imo. And aviv and imo are mentioned, B'nenu zeh, our child, plural, right? Einenu shomea b'kolenu is the plural. Doesn't listen to our voice. Well, it's not just the father. It's the father and the mother. So the Talmud says, b'kolenu, our voice, plural, says the rule only obtains if they have one voice. In other words, if both parents have the same voice, it doesn't mean that they have the same actual voice, because men and women don't have the same voice, right? But there are no soprano men, right? So the point is that, but in terms of what they're saying. So we both said, don't do this, don't do that, don't steal. Because the Talmud assumes that he's a drunkard and a glutton, he steals money to become drunk, etc. All kinds of other requirements to further limit this. But and then if you think about the drasha, it makes a lot of sense, actually. In other words, if you're in a family, you have two parents, and they're constantly disagreeing with each other. There's no unanimity at all. One parent says, you can't do that. The other one says, that's totally fine. They constantly disagreeing. There's no unanimity. So what the Talmud is really saying is, listen, you have this kid who disobeys, but if there's no clear message here, you're getting all kinds of different messages. Of course, he doesn't disobey. He doesn't know whom to obey. You obey X, you disobey Y. There's constantly different messages and different. So in that case, this is not a family about which we can say this child most certainly is a rebellious child. It's going to go out into, maybe not. Maybe if this kid got clear messages, he would be okay. And therefore, the Ben Soreh Umoreh case doesn't obtain if it's Einenu Shemeh B'Kolenu, unless it's B'Kolenu, unless the two of them. And once again, one can raise the question: two people never agree on everything. Obviously, every family has disagreements, but the question is just the extent. The extent. How far do we go with this? But the idea here. My point about B'Kolenu is a drasha on the word B'Kolenu, but there is but it's not just a drasha. But it's actually saying something important about the situation, about the family, and the expectations one can have in a family which is constantly contradictions between the couple. So that's the third example I'm giving of of how in reading the parsha, in effect, they're eliminating it. I mean, as again, on a practical level, it was eliminated way before that, but on a practical level, but they're not saying it doesn't apply. They're not saying we got a voice from heaven which says it doesn't apply anymore. That's not the rabbinic way. The rabbinic way is to say there's some message here which does make sense always for us, even though for many other reasons it's not applicable. Of course, it's true that they're bothered by this parsha, they're bothered by Yer and Yidachet, and the rabbinic traditions, in a sense, as we've seen, we study Pshuto Shel Mikra, and there's no attempt ever to put in not in these sessions, to say that the rabbinic reading is what it actually means. I've never suggested that. I suggest often that there is a rabbinic tradition which is being justified in the text. That I think is true. And furthermore, there's something in these texts that they're picking up on, which is in fact the pshat, or they gain to some very deep understanding of what the parsha is about. So let me stop at this point. Before I get to part two, let me just stop here and to take any comments or questions about what I've mentioned so far about this bein soreh umoreh. Anybody has any comments, questions, or whatever, happy to take that. And then I want to discuss, in the time we have left, this business of the ziknei ha'ir. I want to talk about that. Then we'll wrap things up. Okay, are there any comments or questions?
No comments or questions in chat. But Sigrid, I see you have a question.
Yes, Sigrid.
Do we think this was ever carried out? Ever?
Right. So the Talmud has one view that it was never happened. I mean, part of the reason it never happens, presumably, is they're assuming what parents are going to do this. That's part of the Talmudic thinking. I no doubt is it's not that probable that parents would be willing to take their child, who in a simple reading is a child, it's a kid. He's under the parents, to take their child to be killed because he's drinking or he's a glutton or whatever it is. Remember that the Talmud adds additional requirements to the ben soreh, which are not simply in the text, which is that he's a thief. Because how does he have the money to pay for the, I mean, it's like if you're an alcoholic, okay, or a drug addict, how do you pay for it? Right. If you're a girl, you're a prostitute most of the time. That just comes with the territory. I have kids who deal with these situations. 98% of the young women are prostitutes because they can't pay for the drugs. No one. How do you pay for the drugs? It's expensive. So the Talmud says a similar thing over here. Actually, it's very interesting. What do you mean they're drinking a lot? The parents aren't supporting it. Where are they getting the money to go out and buy the whiskey? Says the Talmud, they're stealing. And who are they stealing from?
Their parents.
They're stealing from their parents. But the point is in other words, that's a further limitation. And then the Talmud has all kinds of other rules. How much must they steal? How much must they eat? What kind of wine are they drinking? When you get through with it, the answer is, if you follow the Talmudic thinking, the chance of happening in 1 in 10 billion, because there's so many requirements. But as I said, we have to remember, this is an important point which people don't really focus on. This is being written hundreds of years after there's no court. So nobody's getting killed anymore. They haven't been killed for hundreds of years. So it's really all theoretical. It's not terrible thing is happening, we got to stop it. It hasn't happened. It's a theoretical construct. The Gemara actually has an expression. The Gemara asks the question, if it never happens, why is it here? To which the Gemara gives a very interesting response. Drosh v'kabel sachar. Study it and get a reward for studying. Which I take to mean there is a message over here. There's a message about family. There's a message about behavior. There's a message about society and the damage to society. It's not just it's not just parents and the kid. There are implications for society in general, etc. That's, I think, what it means, Josh V'Kabel Sachar. In other words, there was something to be learned from this, even though from a practical standpoint, it never happens. But nonetheless, there is an important message here about the construction of a family and about responsibility. And, in theory, look, there are, we are we're all brought up, let's say, to think a certain way within our society, etc. We have certain, but it does sometimes pay to step back and to question some of the things we take for granted in terms of punishment, in terms of in the United States we have millions of people in prison, millions. I don't remember what I read what it costs to keep someone in prison. It's a fortune of money. Someone there for life imprisonment, that's like $50,000 a year, $60,000, $70,000 a year. You're talking about hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of millions of billions of dollars. And the question is, that money, could it be better spent elsewhere? How about make sure everybody has health insurance? These kinds of things. These are questions that, society is set up a certain way. We just take it for granted. But it pays every so often, it pays to think about what are our assumptions about how we function as a society. So what I'm saying is, what the Torah says as the rabbinic understanding is, they're asking this question about about how we treat people who are dangerous to society. Do we let them simply go their merry path? And we know inevitably there's going to be terrible damage. It's clear. The signs are all there. On the other hand, they've done nothing yet. What have they done? Do they drink a little, this, that, the next thing? So it raises some very interesting questions about punishment. As I said, it's certainly the case. We can all think of many examples where someone lived, who knows, 50, 60, 80, whatever it was, and they look back at their lives and they say, somebody had gotten rid of this guy when he was a kid, the world would be a lot better off. But on the other hand, we don't function that way. That's the question I think this parsha raises as far as I'm concerned. Yeah, but I don't think they were eliminating it. It was already eliminated. As the Talmud says, according to one view, it never happened because of so many restrictions that are placed upon it. And on top of it, as I mentioned, because what parent's going to do it? Be a very strange parent who, because the kid is disobedient, takes them out to be killed. So the chances of it actually happening are remote, but there's still something to be learned from the parsha. Okay, that's what I wanted to say about the first parsha. Now, I just wanted to discuss something else as well about a second parsha. Well, there are two other things if we have time. First of all, I want to get back to this point about the elders. Who are these zikanim? I want to emphasize the zikanim as a fixed part of society comes up in the book of Devarim, and only in the book of Devarim, in a very explicit way. And I'll mention several places where it comes up. First of all, we have it in chapter 25. Chapter 25, verse number 5. Chapter 25, verse number 5. Here we have a very, very interesting parsha in the Chumash. This is the parsha which speaks of levirate marriage. Ki yeshvu achim yachdav. So let's spend a few minutes on this. This is the situation. A man is married, and the man dies. Yeshvu achim yachdav, umeis achad mehem uvein ein lo. But he has brothers. He has achim. I'm translating achim as brothers over here. This is the JPS translation, although that's not clear. Achim does mean brothers, but what does brother mean? Does brother mean biological brother, or does brother mean another Jew, like we have today? Hey brother, how you doing? It's not his brother. Brother means we're all brothers, right? We're all related. We're connected. So that's the question. When it says Yeshvu Achim Yachdav, does it mean actual brothers, or does it mean relatives? Right? You have in the Torah, the word ach means a relative, or another Jew, not even a relative. Do not hate your brother in your heart. Doesn't mean your brother. It means don't hate maybe another Jew. Maybe means another person. In a certain sense, we're all brothers and sisters, right? We're all coming from Adam. But the point is, let's limit it to the Jews. But it's certainly not just my brother. Maybe brother sometimes could mean family member, right? Like Abraham says about Sarah, she is my sister. She says actually his sister, but she's his relative, he says. She's related to me, right? From my father's side, she's related. She might be his niece. Medrash thinks she's his niece, and I think it could be true that Yiska and Sarah are the same person. But it doesn't mean she's actually his sister. But she's like a sister. Maybe she's a niece. So the word achot, has multiple meanings. In any event, brothers are together, one dies. Ubein Emil, he has no children. Lo tiyeh eshet hamet achutza lizar. The widow, is not allowed to marry a foreigner or a stranger, it says. Stranger, a zar, a stranger. But rather, Yavama Yavo Aleha, Ukachalo Isha V'Yiba. The Yavama, the lever, must come unto her, supposed to marry her. The purpose that the child will be connected to the dead brother. That's the idea. The firstborn child will be connected to in some way, will rise up, will be accounted to the dead brother, that his name not be blotted out. Let's leave that for a moment. What does that mean? Now, what happens is this. What if the man doesn't want to marry? The lever doesn't want to marry her. Then the Yavama, that the woman, goes up to the gate to the Zakanim, to the elders. Here we have the elders again, El HaZakanim. V'yamra me'ed Yavami lo'akim li'achiv shem b'Yisrael or v'yami. My lever refuses to establish the name for his brother. He refuses to perform Yibum with me. V'karo lo ziknei iro v'dibru elav. V'yamad v'yamar lo chafasi l'chachta. Then the elders of the city, right, call him, and they speak to him. But he says, I don't want to marry her. Then the woman approaches him before the elders. Right? The third time, the elders are mentioned 3 times over here. This is the procedure called chalitza. She pulls the sandal off his foot, spits in his face, and makes this declaration. Thus shall be done to the man who will not build up his brother's house, etc. This is chalitza. This is the parsha of the Torah of Yibum. But the point that I want to emphasize over here, or focus on in the time we have, is the role of the elders. Now, here's one thing that's actually very interesting about the elders over here. So we don't know, one of the big question marks is, in the parsha, who is this Yavam? On the surface of it, a man dies, he's married to a woman, they have no kids. The Yavam is supposed to marry her, because the child born to them will be connected to the dead brother in one form or another. Will extend the kin lines of the dead brother. Fine. Now, it sounds like there's one particular person, as opposed to any relative. Even though we all know that in the 2 stories in the Torah, where there's a kind of yibum, in one case explicitly the word Yavam is used, namely in the story of Judah and Tamar, in that story, the one who performs the yibum is not the brother. The brother is supposed to do it. Judah has 3 sons. 2 sons die. They're married to Tamar. The second son married Tamar, because he's the Yavam. Son number 3 is supposed to marry Tamar, because he's the remaining brother. It sounds like it goes in order of age. But Judah's afraid to permit his 3rd son to marry her. So he sends her away. He says, wait for a while. And she's waiting and waiting. And then Judah's own wife dies. And Tamar pretends to be a prostitute. They sleep together. And that's the Yibum. But in that particular case, the Yibum is performed not by the closest relative, who is the brother, but by the second closest relative. And the same thing appears, of course, in Megillat Ruth. In Megillat Ruth, we have exactly the same situation. Boaz is approached by Ruth, marry me. And Boaz says to Ruth, I'm happy to do it as a Yavam, but there's someone closer. So in the two stories in the Torah which talk about Yibum, what we would call Yibum, the Yibum was not performed by the closest relative. It was performed by the second closest relative. In the parsha over here, it's interesting. The question is, who performs the Yibum? The rabbinic understanding, obviously, is that Yibum is performed only by the brother, nobody else. Only the brother can perform Yibum. The Book of Rules, Judah and Tamar. That's a different situation. Those are different situations for whatever reason, but the rule is only the brother. That's the rabbinic understanding. The Karaites had a different point of view, and the Karaites did not interpret the brother as a brother. In fact, the brother is actually problematic. Why is the brother problematic? Because the brother actually is not allowed to marry his sister-in-law, even after the death of her husband. If his brother died, his wife is forbidden to the brother. Yibum in the Talmud is the exception to the rule. If they have no children, Yibum is permitted, even though you're violating the rule, even though it's incest, actually. A sister-in-law and a brother are incestuous. Permitted in the case of Yibum. The Karaites didn't go for that. And the Karaites further thought that the word brother doesn't mean brother altogether. Therefore, it means relative. Now, whether it means relative or brother is an extreme, and the pshat of the Chumash is an extremely interesting question. And I think there's evidence here in the parsha to both opinions. But I want to leave that out for some other time, even though it's a fascinating question. What interests me is something else. The role of these Zakanim. They're mentioned 3 times over here. And in particular, what's interesting is the following. The brother, called the levir, Levir, is supposed to marry her, perform Yibum, in order to extend the kin lines of his deceased brother. But he says, I don't want to do it. I have no interest. I don't want to marry this woman. Maybe I don't like her. Maybe whatever. I have a wife. I got a family. What do I need it for? I'm interested. Your brother's kin lines? So I feel sorry for my brother, whatever. Not interested. So then, then we're told in verse number 8, it's very interesting. Then the elders summon him and they speak to him. What do you mean they speak to him? What do they say to him? They summon him and speak to him. You can see from the context, and he says, he gets up and says, no, I'm not doing it. In other words, he's responding to them. What they're saying is, you got to marry her. You have to marry her. Your brother died. He had no children. Your responsibility to your brother. You're responsible to your brother. Marry her. He says, no way. Then we have the parsha of chalitza. In other words, in the Chumash, it's obvious. In the Chumash, you're supposed to do Yibum. Chalitza in the Chumash is an alternative. She can then marry anybody else. It frees her, but it's not the preferred way. The Talmud already debates. The Talmud has a dispute where the Chalitza is an equal option. You really have 2 choices, and they're 2 equal choices. You can do Yibum, you can do Chalitza. That's a debate in the Talmud. And then over time, Chalitza becomes the preferred method. Chalitza is preferred. This was one of the great fights in Israel 50, 60, 70 years ago, because the Sephardic Jews who came from the different countries, the Arab lands for the most part, they believed in Yibum, which is the pshat in the Chumash. But in the state of Israel, the government of Israel, the rabbinate, had said, no, we don't do Yibum anymore. But you have the Sephardic Jews who came, 1 million of them, close to 1 million, and their tradition was we'll do Yibum. That was one of the big fights, actually. And the Sephardic rabbinate gave in to the Ashkenazic path, and that Yibum was not performed. At least there might have been some exceptions, but fundamentally, they accepted. There's a whole dispute about this. They accepted the way. Now, why that's so? That's another very interesting topic. I can't get into that. So what actually is at stake? In the Chumash, it's clear. In the Chumash, Yibum is the preferred thing. But my point is something else. What is the role of the elders over here? And that's what you see. The elders have the role, it strikes me, the role of the elders in chapter 25 is similar to the rabbinic understanding of the elders in the parsha of the Ben Soreh Umoreh. Was the point is the Yisruel. In other words, in our parsha, they're interpreting that the elders that the child is brought to the court, and they to bring him to court, and they give him malchut. But another way to think about it is that preliminary to killing the Ben, before you kill a Ben Soreh Moreh, you have to give him a warning, and the warning takes the form of the Yisroel. We're trying to get him to do the right thing. But in this parasha over here, the ones who try to get the guy to do the right thing are Ziknei Iro. And 3 times the Torah mentions Ziknei Iro. And the fact of the matter is that, or twice it's mentioned over here, that it seems like Ziknei Iro are people, they're not judges necessarily, but they're people who have standing within the community. I would say if we want to think about Ziknei Iro in our present context in the United States, I would say synagogue rabbis, actually. Synagogue, but what is the role of the synagogue rabbi? The real role. The role is not to paskin shilas. They're not legal decisors. Most vast majority of the knowledge do it anyway. Their role is to help people, to be a spiritual guide of sorts, or to be able to listen to people's problems, or to be able to hear what people are having to say, give them some kind of religious framework. That's what the good rabbis try to do. They try to give you a religious framework. They're there for you. They try to act as mediators sometimes in disputes. That's exactly what these Zikanim are doing. They're working with people. And I was thinking that actually this description of the Zikanim, here's a family dispute. There's a family dispute in chapter 25, and there's a family issue in our chapter with the Ben Soreh Umoreh, and that the Zikanim are there to try to mediate, to try to help, to try to bring the two together, etc., etc. Certainly in the case, they talk to this guy, says, it's not right, you got to do Yibum. And okay, he refuses. If he refuses, there's a way out, there's the alternative. And I was thinking that actually this description of the Zikanim, you have in these 2 places, and it appears 2 other places as well, I'll get to, but it strikes me, it takes us back to the book of Bamidbar, to the chapter where Moshe complains to God that he can't do the job. Moshe, beginning in chapter 11 of the book of Bamidbar, there's one problem after the next. And Moshe complains to God. In Bamidbar, chapter 11, right after Vayhi ben Soah ha'aron, there's a complaint. Moshe says to God, I can't do this job anymore. It's not for me. You asked me to carry the people like a nursing woman carries a child. I can't do it. I'm not a nursing woman. That's not who I am. I'm not one of the people anyway. I'm an outsider, which he is. I'm a teacher. I'm not one of the people. And furthermore, the people want to eat so much food. Like, how can I get them food? And God said to Moshe in Bamidbar, chapter 11, verse number 18, Vayomar Hashem al Moshe, Esvoli shivim ish mi ziknei Yisrael asher yodatu kihem ziknei ha'am v'shotrav. Says God to Moshe, gather 70 people to the center of the camp. And what do you know about them? You know they are the elders of the nation and v'shotrav, they're officers. Now these 70 people, there's a rabbinic understanding that the 70 are like the 70 members of the court, the Sanhedrin. But the simple pshat of Chumash is not that at all. These, in fact, are not judges. Moshe doesn't want judges. He's got judges. That's not his complaint. We got plenty of judges. We don't have plenty of rabbis, though. We need people that are going to assist them that can speak their language, because I don't talk their language. I'm talking a different language. I have a vision of what should be. I'm a teacher. I'm not going to work with them with their problems. We need people that can talk to them. That's what Aaron does. Aaron the priest, he talks their language. Says God, okay, you gather 70 people. What are their qualifications? And you look at it, what are the qualifications of these people is, Asher Yodatu, these are people that the people accept. When it comes to judges, actually, there are criteria for judges. When Yitro said to Moshe, get judges, he said, honest people, people with integrity, people that have no fear, people that fear God. Those were Yitro's qualifications in chapter 18 of Shemot. In the book of Devarim, Chachamim Yeduim, Chachamim Unevonim. Why? Wisdom, intellectual strength. That's what we need for judges. These people have no qualities, actually. You know they are the elders. They are respected by the community. Gather them to you. And God says to Moshe, and by the way, you got to give them a crash course. Make sure they gather to you, because they do their own thing, but they get in trouble. You have to be connected to you. You have to instruct them. You have to teach them. But at the end of the day, they're going to deal with the people, and they can talk to the people, and the people respect them, and they can carry your burden. You're not a nursing father. That's not you. I know that. You got it. But on the other hand, you don't want people that are so disconnected from the tradition. Who knows what they're going to say? They're just a bunch of ignoramuses. We can't have that either. So you got to give them some kind of knowledge. Okay, because they're going to be working with the people. Give them some knowledge. That's Ziknei Ha'am. And that's what you have over here in Sefer Devarim. That's the role of these Zikanim. They're not judges, but they're people that work with people, and specifically with problems that people have. And many of the problems people have deal with relationships. In this case, it's a potential potential husband-wife. It's a complicated situation. She was married to the guy's brother. You know what I mean? It's complicated. And it's not some stranger, you know. Maybe he knows her well. Maybe he doesn't like her. Who knows? You know what I mean? All kinds of reasons. He has his own problems. So what do you do? So the Zikanim come in. Ben Sorel Morel, we have the Zikanim. There, when it comes to the family relationship and how that affects the community, that's the Zikanim. And I want to mention that the Zikanim come up in the book of Devarim in a couple of other places, which actually confirms that what I'm saying is right. And one of them is a parsha that we saw already. Let me just mention this, and I will have to stop in a couple of minutes. I'll take a couple of his comments and questions. But in chapter 22, we saw this parsha, the defaming husband. The husband who claims that this woman that he married had an affair, slept with somebody else, and she could be put to death. And the family denies it. The family says, that's not the case. No, it's not true. Our daughter had no affairs or anything like that. So that's found in chapter 22, beginning in verse number 13. It's called the Parsha of Motzi Shemra. So they have the mother, father, and the mother. They take the girl up in verse number 15, and they bring evidence of her virginity. They bring it to the Zikanim. And verse 16, they speak to the Zikanim. The man says, I gave my daughter to this man as a wife, and he hates her. He's just defaming her because he hates her. Right? He defamed her. He said things that are not true about her. And here we have evidence it is true. And they show the evidence before the Ziknei Ha'ir, before the Zikanim. And then at verse number 18, and the Zikanim take this man, the Yisruoto, and they put the Zikanim punish him. Or maybe means they discipline him, they talk to him, they give him a talking, which we have later in chapter 25. When they talk to him, say, you gotta marry her. You gotta marry her. It's not right. It's not right. And he says, I don't care what you say. I'm not marrying her. Okay. Then we go through the choletzet ceremony, which is a degrading ceremony for him in the Chumash. But you see, the Zikanim have a similar. In all of these cases, it's about family. It's about, and the role of the Zikanim, they're trying to resolve this problem. They're the mediators. In this case, they're not just adjudicating it, but they also give them a talking to. They're presenting this is the right path. And then the punishment, either they punish him or the court punishes him. But the role of the Zikanim, 3 times you have Zikanim over here in chapter 22. And then the Zikanim appear. So we have the Yibum case, we have the Motzi Shemra case, we have the Ben Sareh Umoreh case, and we have one more case with the Zikanim figure in the most interesting way. And I have to conclude with this, and that is also in Sefer Devarim, of course. And this is Sefer Devarim, chapter 21. Sefer Devarim, chapter 21. What is Sefer Devarim, chapter 21? Sefer Devarim, chapter 21 is what happens if you find a corpse. sounds like somebody has been killed. But we can't find the murderer. What do you do in such a case? So in such a case, someone has to take responsibility for it. The idea of the Chumash is the community has to take responsibility. If someone's been murdered, it pollutes the whole community, it pollutes the land, it pollutes the community. It pollutes the cities. So what do you do in such a case? There's a whole procedure, and this is the parasha called Egla Arufa. Egla Arufa. In the parasha of Egla Arufa, verse number 2, V'yatzu zikeinecha v'shoftecha. Your judges and your zikanim. They both go out, two different groups. There are judges and there are elders. And they measure from the corpse to the closest city. And when you find out what the closest city is in the next verse, and next verse, so over there, the elders of the city, here we have the elders. The elders of the city were mentioned in all these verses. They're mentioned in verse number 2? Verse number 2 and 3. Let me find 1 second. Verse number 2, we have the elders. Verse number 3, we have the elders. Verse number 4, we have the elders. Verse number 4. We have the elders, and then in verse number 6, we have the elders. And the point over here is, what's interesting, you have elders, you have judges, and you have priests, you have kohanim. But the focus seems to be upon the elders of the city. In other words, it's about the elders of the city represent the city which has a responsibility for this particular person. It's not a judgment case, but the city is responsible because, for whatever reason, because we presume that the city has something to do with the fact. Maybe the murderer came from the city. Maybe the city did not provide the appropriate protection for this person who went out alone and was murdered, etc., etc. The Talmud raised questions, why are they responsible? But they are responsible. So it's not about judging. There's a group of people who take responsibility for their community. And that means for their community and for the building block of the community, the family. And that's their role, which is actually, I think, a very, very interesting role. And it fits in well with what we've studied so far in the book of Devarim. Because yes, there are judges and there are prophets and there are kings and there are priests. But then there's also the whole other side, which is the way people live, just on the daily day, the way people are living. Who's responsible for the daily life of the community? Judges are responsible. When someone has a case, you go to the judge. But the point is that the zikanim, when something happens, the zikanim are involved. But there's a sense over here that the zikanim are deeply connected to the people in the town and to the families. Exactly what Moshe Rabbeinu said. He says this is a very, very important thing to have. It's not something that I can do. This is not me. I'm not that person. I'm not made to do that job. I do other things. I can present a vision for where the world should be, the way society should be. I can give them rules and regulations. I can pray for them. I can defend them. I can advocate for them. I can do many things, but I can't hold the hand. That's what he says. I can't. We don't talk the same language, you know. I'm here, they're there. So God says, okay, so to find the zikanim, find the people that the people see as their leaders, and train them. Make sure they come to you, because otherwise they get into trouble. They'll go off their own path and say all kinds of stuff. But you need to be trained, obviously. So just to round out what we've studied so far in terms of the institutional leadership, it is, apart from everything else, we have zikanim who figure in these 4 different situations in Sefer Devarim. Let me stop at this point. So I thought it would be good we added these 4 sessions just because I felt it's it's important in Sefer Devarim actually, and there's so much more here. So we'll see what next time we meet. I'll try to figure out what we're doing next. I did want to mention that a week from tomorrow, a week from today, next Sunday, there's my book on kingship, it's like kingship. It's really about power and kingship, and readings in Sefer Shmuel, which I think the book is. I think it's a very good book, but I also think it's very relevant to today's world. There's an event in HIR in Riverdale called the Bayit, HIR, 7 o'clock. Anybody interested in coming, everybody's welcome to come. The book will be there for sale, and I'll give a shiur about some elements of the book of Shmuel. The book was sponsored by the Bulos, the Tova Bulos, one of our regulars here, and she sponsored the book. Thank you once again, Tova. If you can make it, I think it should be an interesting evening. Anyway, thank you very much for these 4 sessions, and looking forward to running with you in the future as well.
Thank you. Yep. Thank you, everyone, for joining. And in addition to the book
you.
talk, Rabbi Silber will be teaching a few more times over Zoom this summer at Drisha. He is currently teaching Mishnah in depth on Kalim. This is a asynchronous class where videos are released monthly. You can still sign up to get the second video sent straight to your inbox on July 12th. Rabbi Silber will also be teaching on Tisha B'Av, on explanatory keynote, along with several other members of Drisha staff on July 23rd. You can sign up for that at drisha.org/classes as well. And Rabbi Michael Bernstein is in the middle of a 10-week asynchronous course on the Haftarot before and after Tisha B'Av, Catastrophe and Consolation, reading the Haftarot. This also is an asynchronous class, so videos will come straight to your inbox if you sign up. With that, take care, everyone. Thank you for learning, and this class will resume in the fall.